I thought work would save me from loneliness until I realized some of my coworkers were dead and others were far worse. Before we begin our first story, leave a like, subscribe, and share this tale with someone you care about. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time is it there. I need to tell you about something that happened to me in 1994 while I was working at a textile factory in North Carolina. I was 61 years old at the time, and I had taken the job because Frank had passed away 2 years earlier. I needed something to fill my days. I couldn't bear the loneliness. I needed something to keep me occupied, something to distract my mind. The factory produced industrial fabrics for upholstery and automobile interiors. It was a massive 4-story building with the production floor taking up most of the space. The management offices were located on the 2nd floor, overlooking the machines below. I worked in the accounting department, processing invoices and managing payments to suppliers. It was a quiet, calm job. I didn't want something fast-paced or hectic. I'd had enough of that kind of stress in my life. The factory operated in 2 shifts. The day shift ended at 6 in the evening, and the night shift began at 10. There was a 4-hour gap in between, and during that time, the building was supposed to be empty, except for the cleaning crew. But as you know, accounting has its busy periods when paperwork needs to be finished quickly, and sometimes I had to stay until 8 or 9 at night. At least having work to do kept my mind occupied, and I liked the silence. The phones didn't ring, no one asked me questions. It was just me, my calculator, and the hum of the fluorescent lights. That was when I started to notice Marcus. Marcus was the night janitor. He was a thin man in his 50s, with hollow cheeks and eyes that never seemed to blink. He always wore the same gray coveralls and pushed a yellow mop bucket whose wheels squeaked every time they turned. The first time I saw him, it was around 7:30 in the evening. I was the only person left in the office area, or so I thought. I heard the squeaking sound coming from the hallway. Then I saw him at the far end of the corridor, mopping the floor with long, slow movements. He hadn't noticed me. He just moved closer to my desk, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Good evening," I said, trying to be friendly. He stopped mopping. He lifted his head and looked at me, but he didn't say anything. He just stared. The expression on his face was completely blank, as if I were looking at a mannequin. After what felt like a full minute, he went back to mopping without a word. I felt uncomfortable, but I told myself he was just shy or maybe hard of hearing. I went back to my work, trying to ignore the squeaking that was getting louder as he approached. He mopped right up to my desk, so close that I had to pull my feet up onto the chair rung to avoid the wet floor. He stood there, wringing out his mop, taking his time. I could smell him, a mixture of bleach and something sour, like spoiled milk. "I'll be done in about 20 minutes, I said, hoping he'd move on to another area. Marcus didn't respond. He just stared at the floor near my feet. Then, very slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, the kind that makes your stomach drop. He finally moved on, but I packed up my things and left immediately. Something about him made my skin crawl. Over the next few weeks, I tried to time my departures to leave before Marcus arrived. But it seemed like no matter when I planned to leave, he would show up early. If I aimed to leave at 7 p.m., he'd be there at 6:45. If I waited until 8 p.m., there he was at 7:30, pushing that squeaking bucket down the hallway. And he always ended up near my desk. Always. I mentioned it to my supervisor, a nice woman named Patricia. "Who schedules the cleaning crew?" I asked her one afternoon. "That's handled by the facility manager downstairs," she said. "Why? Is there a problem?" I hesitated. What could I say? The janitor makes me uncomfortable because he smiles. Weird? "No problem," I said. "Just curious." But the situation was getting worse. Marcus started leaving things on my desk. Small things. A paperclip bent into a strange shape. A wadded-up piece of paper with nothing written on it. Once, I found a dead moth placed carefully in the center of my keyboard. I threw them all away, but they kept appearing. And every time I looked up, I'd catch Marcus watching me. From somewhere in the office, he'd be standing in a doorway, or behind a cubicle partition, or reflected in a window, just watching, with that terrible blank expression. One Thursday evening in November, I was working later than usual. There was a problem with a vendor payment that needed to be resolved before Friday's deadline. It was already 9:30 p.m., and I knew the night shift would be arriving soon. I needed another 30 minutes, maybe 45 at most. The building was completely silent except for the hum of the heating system. I was alone on the entire second floor, or so I thought. Then I heard it, that familiar squeak, squeak, squeak of Marcus's mop bucket. But it was coming from directly above me, from the third floor. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The third floor was executive offices, and they were always locked after 6 p.m. How did Marcus get up there? And why was he up there when my floor still needed to be cleaned? The squeaking stopped. Then I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, walking across the ceiling above my head. They moved slowly from one end of the building to the other, then stopped directly over my desk. A long silence followed. I held my breath, listening. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might give me away, though I don't know why I was worried about being quiet. I had every right to be there. Then the footsteps started again, but this time they were moving toward the stairwell. They were coming down. I grabbed my purse and my coat. I didn't shut down my computer or organize my papers. I just stood up and walked quickly toward the exit on the opposite end of the floor. But as I passed the stairwell door, it burst open. Marcus stood there, blocking the doorway. He wasn't holding his mop. He was just standing there, arms at his sides, staring at me. "You're here late," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "I had work to finish," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Excuse me, I need to get past." He didn't move. "It's not safe for you to be here alone." "I'm leaving now," I said. "Please move." Marcus tilted his head slightly, like he was studying me. "Women your age shouldn't work late. Bad things happen in empty buildings." That was a threat. There was no other way to interpret it. I felt a surge of anger cut through my fear. "Move, now!" For a moment, I thought he wouldn't. But then, he stepped aside, just enough for me to squeeze past him. As I did, he leaned in close and whispered, "I'll see you tomorrow, Margaret." He knew my name. Of course he did. It was on my desk nameplate. But hearing it from his mouth made me feel violated. I practically ran to the parking lot. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely get my key into the car door. I sat in my car with the doors locked, catching my breath, trying to convince myself that I'd overreacted. Maybe he was just trying to be helpful. Maybe he was socially awkward and didn't realize how threatening he sounded. But I knew better. My instincts were screaming at me that something was very wrong with Marcus. The next day, I went straight to the facility manager. His name was Mr. Dunmore, a gruff man in his 60s who ran the building maintenance operations. I told him about Marcus, about the strange behavior, the watching, the things left on my desk, and the confrontation in the stairwell. Mr. Dunmore listened, his expression growing more troubled as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Walsh, we don't have a night janitor named Marcus." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What?" "Our cleaning crew is contracted through an outside company. 3 people, all women. They've been with us for 5 years. There's no man on that crew." "But I've seen him," I insisted. "Multiple times. He's there almost every night, mopping the floors." Mr. Dunmore frowned. "Can you describe him?" I did. As I spoke, I watched his face change. He went pale. "Wait here," he said, standing up abruptly. He left his office and returned a few minutes later with a folder. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across the desk to me. "Is this him?" I looked at the photo. It was an employee ID picture from years ago, but I recognized him immediately. Same hollow cheeks, same unsettling eyes. "Yes," I said, "that's Marcus." Mr. Dunmore sat down heavily. Marcus Pettigrew worked here as a maintenance supervisor from 1971 to 1989. He was fired after several female employees filed complaints about his behavior. Stalking, harassment, inappropriate comments. The final straw was when he was caught breaking into the women's locker room after hours. "Where is he now?" I asked. Mr. Dunmore's face was grim. "He's dead, Mrs. Walsh. Marcus Pettigrew died in 1991. He had a heart attack in his apartment and wasn't found for 3 days." The room seemed to tilt. That's impossible. I've talked to him. He spoke to me last night. I believe you saw someone, Mr. Dunmore said carefully. But it wasn't Marcus Pettigrew. Someone's been impersonating him, maybe using his old ID to get into the building after hours. But I knew what I'd seen. The way Marcus moved, the way he appeared and disappeared without sound, the way he seemed to know things about me without being told. This wasn't an impersonator. This was something else. Mr. Dunmore called the police. They took my statement and agreed to increase patrols around the building in the evenings. They checked the security logs, but there was no record of anyone using Marcus Pettigrew's old ID to access the building. The third-floor executive offices had been locked every night, with no signs of forced entry. I stopped working late. I made sure to leave by 5:30 every day, while the building was still full of people. But it didn't matter. Marcus started appearing during the day. I'd see him in reflections, standing behind me in the glass of my computer monitor. I'd turn around, and no one would be there. I'd catch glimpses of him at the end of hallways, disappearing around corners. Once, I found wet mop streaks on the floor leading from the stairwell to my desk, even though the cleaning crew had already finished their work hours earlier. Other people started noticing strange things too. Cold spots in certain areas of the building, doors that locked themselves, the sound of that squeaking mop bucket echoing through empty corridors. But I was the only one who actually saw him. One afternoon, I was in the women's restroom washing my hands. I looked up at the mirror and saw Marcus standing in one of the stalls behind me. The stall door was open, and he was just standing there, motionless, staring at my reflection. I screamed and spun around. The stall was empty. I quit that day. I walked into Patricia's office, told her I was done, and left my keys and ID badge on her desk. She tried to convince me to stay, offering me a different shift or a transfer to a different department. But I refused. I couldn't be in that building anymore. As I was packing up my desk, gathering my personal belongings, I felt someone watching me. I looked up, and there he was, standing at the far end of the office near the windows. Marcus was holding his mop, water dripping onto the carpet, forming a dark puddle around his feet. He raised an hand and waved at me, a slow, deliberate wave. Then he smiled that terrible smile. I grabbed my box and ran. I found out later that 3 more women quit within 6 months, all citing the same reason. They felt unsafe in the building, like they were being watched constantly. One woman claimed she'd been followed home by a man in gray coveralls driving a beat-up van. She filed a police report, but they never found him. The factory closed in 1998, shut down due to declining business. The building sat empty for years, deteriorating slowly. I drove past it once, about 10 years ago, just out of curiosity. The windows were broken, the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and there was a chain link fence around the perimeter. But as I slowed down to look, I saw movement in one of the second-floor windows. A figure, thin and gray, standing motionless behind the dirty glass. I didn't stop. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator and didn't look back. I'm 89 years old now, and I still think about Marcus. I think about how he knew my name, how he seemed to know when I'd be alone, how he appeared in places he shouldn't have been able to access. And I think about what Mr. Dunmore told me when I went back to ask more questions after I'd quit. He'd done some digging into Marcus Pettigrew's history. It turned out Marcus had been investigated years ago, long before his death, in connection with the disappearance of a young woman who worked at the factory in 1987. She'd been working late, alone, finishing up a project. She left the building at 9:45 p.m., according to the security log. Her car was found in the parking lot the next morning, keys still in the ignition, but she was never seen again. The police questioned Marcus because several employees had reported seeing him watching the woman obsessively in the weeks before she vanished. But there was no evidence, and the case went cold. Mr. Dunmore believed Marcus had something to do with her disappearance, and he believed Marcus had been planning to do the same thing to me. "You were lucky," he told me. "You listened to your instincts and got out before it was too late." But I don't feel lucky. I feel haunted, because sometimes, even now, when I'm alone in my apartment late at night, I hear it. Squeak, squeak, squeak. The sound of a mop bucket rolling slowly down a hallway, getting closer and closer to my door. Before moving on to the second story, if you liked the first one, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd really love to know what you think. Now, let me tell you what happened in 2001, because that was when I learned that sometimes the most dangerous person in your workplace isn't a stranger, but the coworker sitting right beside you. I was 68 years old and working part-time at an insurance company in Richmond, Virginia. After my experiences at the textile factory, silence no longer felt comforting. I had sworn never to work in an isolated building again. This office was perfect, bright and modern, located in a busy commercial area surrounded by shops and restaurants. There were 40 employees, and the place was full of activity every day from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening. I worked as a data processor in the claims department. My job was simple: reviewing claim forms, entering information into the computer system, and flagging any inconsistencies for the adjusters to review. It was a peaceful job where I could work without stress and also socialize at the office. My desk was part of a group of 4 arranged in a square so that we all faced one another. To my left was Janet, a pleasant woman in her 50s who constantly talked about her grandchildren. Across from me was Dennis, a tense young man fresh out of college who always looked buried in paperwork. And to my right was Caroline. Caroline was 34 years old, with a sharp, professional beauty. She had perfectly styled blonde hair, expensive suits, and a smile that could sell anything. She had been with the company for 6 years, and it was widely believed that she was on a fast track toward management. Everyone loved Caroline. She was helpful, cheerful, and always the first to volunteer for extra projects. I liked her too. We weren't close friends, but we had a pleasant working relationship. Sometimes she brought me coffee, asked about my weekend, and shared office gossip in a way that felt playful rather than malicious. Then the promotion was announced. Our department supervisor, a woman named Mrs. Chen, was retiring at the end of the year. The company was going to promote someone from within to take her place. It was a significant step up. Better pay, better benefits, a private office, and real authority over the department. Everyone assumed Caroline would get it. She was the obvious choice. She had seniority, excellent performance reviews, and she'd been practically doing Mrs. Chen's job already, covering for her during vacations and sick days. But then management made a surprising decision. They announced that they were opening the position to all department members and that they'd be conducting formal interviews over the next month. Anyone could apply. Caroline's smile didn't waver when the announcement was made, but I saw something flicker in her eyes, something cold and calculating. Dennis applied for the position, though everyone knew he didn't have a chance. Janet applied too, mostly as a formality. And then Sandra applied. Sandra worked in the cubicle behind us. She was 42, quiet and competent. She'd been with the company for 8 years, longer than Caroline. Sandra didn't socialize much, didn't play office politics, and kept to herself. But her work was flawless. She had the highest accuracy rate in the department and had single-handedly reorganized our filing system the year before, saving the company thousands of dollars in efficiency improvements. Sandra was a genuine contender, and Caroline knew it. The atmosphere in our little cluster changed overnight. Caroline's cheerfulness took on a brittle edge. She stopped bringing me coffee. She stopped chatting with Janet about weekend plans. And whenever Sandra walked by, Caroline would watch her with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Can you believe Sandra applied?" Caroline said to me one morning, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I mean, good for her, I guess. But she has no leadership experience. None. She can barely manage a conversation, let alone a whole department. I didn't respond. Something about the way Caroline was talking made me uneasy. Over the next 2 weeks, strange things started happening to Sandra. Her computer would mysteriously crash, losing hours of work. Important emails she'd sent would somehow end up in people's spam folders, making her look disorganized and unreliable. Files she needed for her interview preparation disappeared from the shared drive. Sandra grew increasingly stressed. I could see the exhaustion in her face. the way her hands shook when she tried to hold her coffee cup. She started staying late to redo work that had been lost, coming in early to search for missing files. And through it all, Caroline was there, offering sympathy, offering help, suggesting that maybe the stress of the interview process was too much for Sandra, that maybe she should withdraw her application and try again when a different position opened up. "I'm just worried about her," Caroline told me one afternoon, her voice full of fake concern. "She looks terrible. I think she's having a nervous breakdown." But I'd been watching, and I'd noticed things that others hadn't. I'd noticed Caroline staying late, long after most people had gone home. I'd noticed her sitting at Sandra's desk once, when Sandra was in a meeting, her fingers flying across Sandra's keyboard. When I asked what she was doing, she'd laughed and said she was just leaving a nice note to cheer Sandra up. I'd noticed Caroline in the server room where she had no legitimate reason to be. When I mentioned it to Janet, she brushed it off. "Caroline's probably just helping it with something. She's always helping people." But I knew better. I'd lived through enough workplace toxicity to recognize sabotage when I saw it. The day before the final interviews, something happened that confirmed my suspicions. I came in early, around 7 a.m., to finish some reports. The office was almost empty. As I walked past the copy room, I heard voices. 2 people arguing in harsh whispers. I stopped, standing just outside the doorway where I couldn't be seen. "I told you to back off." It was Carolyn's voice, but stripped of all its usual sweetness. It was cold, venomous. "I have every right to apply for this position." Sandra's voice was shaking, but defiant. "You can't intimidate me into withdrawing." "Can't I?" Caroline laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You have no idea what I'm capable of. You think the computer crashes were accidents. You think your files just disappeared? I've been destroying your credibility for weeks, and no one suspects a thing. Because everyone loves me, Sandra. Everyone trusts me." "You're insane," Sandra whispered. "No, I'm ambitious. There's a difference, and here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk into Mrs. Chen's office this morning and tell her you're withdrawing your application. You're going to say the stress is too much, that you've realized you're not ready for management. And if I don't?" There was a long pause. Then Caroline spoke, and her voice was so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it sent chills down my spine. "Then I'll make sure everyone knows about your drinking problem." "I don't have a drinking problem." "Not yet. But you will once I start bringing in empty vodka bottles and hiding them in your desk drawers. Once I start sending emails from your account at 2 a.m. with obvious typos and inappropriate content. Once I start spreading rumors about you showing up to work drunk. By the time you figure out what's happening, your reputation will be destroyed. You'll be fired, and I'll have my promotion." I heard Sandra start to cry, soft, defeated sobs. "You have until 9 a.m. to decide," Caroline said. "Choose wisely." I heard footsteps approaching the door. I quickly moved away, ducking into the ladies' room just as Caroline emerged from the copy room. Through the small gap in the door, I watched her walk back to our desk cluster. She was smiling, humming softly to herself. I stayed in the bathroom for a long time, trying to process what I'd heard. Then I made a decision. I went straight to Mrs. Chen's office and told her everything. The sabotage, the threats, the overheard conversation in the copy room. Mrs. Chen listened carefully, her expression growing graver with every word. "Can you prove any of this?" she asked when I finished. "No," I admitted, "but Sandra can. If you ask her about the conversation in the copy room, she'll confirm it." Mrs. Chen nodded slowly. "Thank you for coming to me, Margaret. I'll handle this." I went back to my desk. Caroline was already there, typing away on her computer, that perfect smile on her face. She looked up as I sat down. "Morning, Margaret. You're in early. Dedicated as always." I didn't respond. I just turned on my computer and started working. At 9:15 a.m., Sandra was called into Mrs. Chen's office. She was in there for 45 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red, but she looked relieved. At 10 a.m., Caroline was called in. She went confidently, her head held high. She came out 20 minutes later, escorted by security. Her face was white with rage. As she was walked past our desks to collect her personal belongings, she looked straight at me. And she knew. Somehow, she knew I was the one who'd told. "You have no idea what you've done," she hissed at me. "No idea." Security escorted her out of the building. We found out later that day that she'd been fired immediately for workplace harassment and sabotage. The IT department had been able to trace the computer crashes and deleted files back to her account. Sandra's interview went forward as planned, and she got the promotion she deserved. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. Caroline knew where I lived. I'd made the mistake of giving her my address once when we'd organized a department potluck and people were signing up to bring dishes. 2 weeks after she was fired, things started appearing on my doorstep. A dead bird, a bag of garbage, a note that said, "You should have minded your own business, old woman." I called the police, but without proof that Caroline was the one leaving these things, there wasn't much they could do. They increased patrols in my neighborhood and told me to install security cameras, which I did. The items stopped appearing, but the phone calls started. 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a night. Always from blocked numbers. Sometimes there was heavy breathing on the other end. Sometimes there was just silence. Once, a voice whispered, "I know you're alone in there. I know you're scared. Good." I stopped sleeping through the night. I kept every light in my apartment on. I checked the locks obsessively. Then, one night, it escalated. I was lying in bed around 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling, when I heard my doorknob rattle. Someone was trying to get in. I froze, listening to the sound of someone jiggling the lock, trying to force it open. I grabbed the phone and called 911, whispering my address to the operator. The doorknob stopped rattling. I heard footsteps running down the hallway of my apartment building. Then the stairwell door banging open. Police arrived 6 minutes later. But whoever had been there was long gone. The officers found scratches on my lock where someone had tried to pick it. They recommended I stay with family for a few days. I called my daughter Linda. She picked me up that night, and I stayed with her for 2 weeks. During that time, my apartment building's security cameras were reviewed. The footage showed a woman matching Caroline's description, entering the building at 1:47 a.m. and leaving at 2:03 a.m. Her face was partially hidden by a baseball cap, but her build and the way she moved matched Caroline perfectly. An arrest warrant was issued, but Caroline had disappeared. She'd stopped paying rent on her apartment, stopped showing up at her gym, stopped using her credit cards. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. For 3 months, I jumped at every unexpected sound. I stopped going out alone at night. I had a security system installed in my apartment and double locks put on all the doors and windows. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from a detective. Caroline had been arrested in Tennessee, pulled over for a routine traffic violation. When they ran her information, the warrant from Virginia came up. She was extradited, charged with stalking and attempted breaking and entering. She took a plea deal, spent 18 months in jail, and was ordered to stay away from me permanently as a condition of her release. I never saw her again, but the experience changed me. It taught me that evil doesn't always come from shadows or strangers. Sometimes it comes from the person who brings you coffee and asks about your weekend. Sometimes it wears a beautiful smile and expensive suits. Sometimes the monster is the one everyone loves. And by the time you realize what they really are, they've already gotten close enough to destroy you. The third and final story I need to tell you happened in 2008, when I was 75 years old. By then, I should have been retired, enjoying my golden years, but the economy had collapsed, and my savings didn't stretch as far as I had hoped. It was truly a very difficult year, and because of that, I took a job as a receptionist at a small accounting firm in Charleston, South Carolina. Honestly, having to work at an age when I should have been resting weighed heavily on me. The firm was called Berkshire and Associates, though there was really only one Berkshire. The owner, Mr. Martin Berkshire. He was a man in his 60s, arrogant, and he treated the office like his personal kingdom. There were only 8 employees, 3 accountants, 2 administrative assistants, 1 bookkeeper, 1 IT specialist, and me at the reception desk. The office itself was an unremarkable place. It was located on the 3rd floor of an old building downtown, with wood-paneled walls and outdated furniture that likely hadn't been replaced since the 1980s. But what made the office strange was the conference room. It sat at the end of a long corridor, past all the other offices. The door was made of heavy oak and had a small window at eye level. The room was used for client meetings, but not very often. Most clients preferred to meet their accountant in a warmer, more welcoming setting. That conference room felt unsettling somehow. The conference room was always cold, even in the middle of summer, when the rest of the office was stifling and the air conditioning struggled to keep up. That room was icy. People joked about it. "Must be ghosts," they would say, laughing. But I didn't find it funny, because sometimes, when I walked past that conference room, I felt as though someone was watching me through that small window. I would look, and the room would be empty. But the feeling never went away. The receptionist before me was a woman named Helen. After working there for 12 years, she had quit suddenly and without notice. When I asked Mr. Berkshire about her during the interview, he brushed the question aside. In truth, my past experiences were telling me I shouldn't take this job. But the crisis was at its peak, and I had no other choice. "Helen had personal issues," he'd said, waving his hand vaguely. "Nothing to do with the job. She just left one day and never came back." I found out later that wasn't quite true. One of the accountants, a friendly man named Robert, told me the real story during my second week. "Helen started acting paranoid," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. She kept saying someone was following her, someone from the office. She'd come in every morning looking exhausted, saying she hadn't slept because she kept hearing noises outside her apartment. Then one day, she packed up her things at lunch and just walked out, never even collected her final paycheck. "Did they ever figure out who was following her?" I asked. Robert shrugged. "There was no one following her. At least, that's what everyone thinks. Helen was probably just stressed and imagining things. This job can be demanding." But I noticed Robert didn't meet my eyes when he said it, and I noticed he never stayed late at the office. None of them did. By 5:30 p.m., the place was deserted, except for me and Mr. Berkshire, who usually worked until 7 or 8 p.m. in his private office. During my first month, I was too busy learning the job to pay much attention to the conference room. But then, small things started happening. I'd walk past the room and find the door slightly ajar, even though I distinctly remembered it being closed. I'd hear muffled sounds coming from inside, scraping, like furniture being moved. But when I checked, the room was empty and everything was in its proper place. Once, I heard voices, two people having a conversation, the words too muffled to make out. I knocked on the door, thinking someone was having an unscheduled meeting. But when I opened it, the room was empty, completely silent. I mentioned it to Mr. Berkshire. He laughed it off. "Old building," he said. "Sound travels in strange ways. You're probably hearing conversations from the office next door." But we didn't share walls with another office. On one side was a stairwell. On the other was an exterior wall facing the street. The incidents escalated. I started finding things moved on my desk when I returned from lunch. My stapler shifted, papers rearranged, my coffee mug turned to face a different direction. Small things, things that could easily be explained as me misremembering where I'd left them. But I knew better. I'd started taking photos of my desk before I left for breaks, just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. The items were definitely being moved. Then came the day I saw her. It was a Wednesday afternoon in October. Everyone had gone to lunch except me and Mr. Berkshire. I was at my desk eating a sandwich when I heard footsteps in the hallway, high heels clicking rhythmically on the wood floor. I looked up, expecting to see one of the administrative assistants returning early. But the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, growing louder, heading toward the conference room. I heard the conference room door open and close. I stood up and walked down the hallway. Through the small window in the conference room door, I could see someone sitting at the table. A woman with dark hair pulled back in a bun. She was wearing a gray cardigan and sitting factly still, staring straight ahead at nothing. I knocked on the door. "Excuse me? Can I help you?" The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge me at all. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was empty, completely empty. No woman, no disturbed chairs, nothing. But the temperature in the room was so cold, I could see my breath. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, lavender perfume. I backed out of the room quickly, my heart pounding. I went to Mr. Berkshire's office and told him what I'd seen. He looked annoyed, like I was wasting his time with foolishness. "Margaret, you're 75 years old. Maybe it's time to get your eyes checked. There's no one in this building but you and me." But I knew what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the woman's face. Something about it had been familiar, but I couldn't place it. The next morning, I came in early and searched through the old employee files in the storage room. I found what I was looking for buried in a box marked 1995 to 2000. It was a staff photo from 1997. The entire office standing together in front of the building, smiling for the camera. And there, in the back row, was the woman I'd seen in the conference room. Same dark hair, same gray cardigan. The caption underneath identified her as Diane Morrison, senior accountant. I asked Robert about her when he came in. His face went pale. "Where did you hear that name?" "I found an old photo." "Who was she?" Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Diane worked here for 15 years. She was brilliant, the best accountant we had. But she and Mr. Berkshire had a falling out. Some kind of dispute about client billing. She threatened to report him to the state board for unethical practices. A week later, she was found dead in her apartment, carbon monoxide poisoning. The investigators ruled it accidental, faulty water heater." "When did this happen?" "December 1999, almost 9 years ago." "Did anyone think it was suspicious?" Robert looked around nervously. "Some people had questions. Diane was meticulous about home maintenance. Hard to believe she wouldn't have noticed a faulty water heater. But there was no evidence of foul play, and the case was closed quickly." That night, I stayed late to finish some filing. Mr. Berkshire was still in his office, and I could hear him on the phone, arguing with someone about a client account. Around 6:30 p.m., I finished my work and started gathering my things to leave. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps in the hallway. High heels. Click, 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 heading toward the conference room. I stood up slowly, my stomach twisting with dread. The footsteps stopped at the conference room door. I heard it open, then silence. I waited, listening. After a full minute, I forced myself to walk down the hallway. Through the window in the door, I could see her again. Diane, sitting at the conference table in the exact same position, staring straight ahead. But this time, as I watched, she slowly turned her head and looked directly at me. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets filled with shadow. Her mouth opened, and I heard a voice, not from the room, but inside my head. "He killed me!" I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. The conference room door swung open on its own, and that smell of lavender perfume rolled out into the hallway, overwhelmingly strong. "Margaret?" Mr. Berkshire's voice came from his office. "Is everything all right?" I couldn't speak. I just stared at the conference room. Diane was gone, but I could still feel her presence, cold and angry and desperate. "Margaret!" Mr. Berkshire appeared in the hallway, looking annoyed. He followed my gaze to the open conference room door. His face changed. For just a moment, I saw fear flash across his features. "Go home," he said abruptly. "You're clearly not feeling well." I left. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Diane had said. He killed me. I spent the next 2 days researching Diane Morrison's death. The newspaper articles were brief, just a few paragraphs noting the tragic accident. But I found her obituary, and it mentioned that she was survived by a sister, Patricia Morrison, living in Colombia. I called Patricia. I told her I'd worked at Berkshire and Associates and wanted to talk about her sister. She was hesitant at first, but when I mentioned that I'd seen Diane's ghost, something in her voice changed. "You saw her too," Patricia said. It wasn't a question. "Other people have seen her over the years. That's why they can never keep a receptionist for more than a few months. Diane's trying to tell someone what happened to her." "What did happen?" "Martin Berkshire was stealing from clients," Patricia said, her voice bitter. "Diane discovered it and confronted him. She told him she was going to report him unless he made it right. 2 days later, she was dead. The police said it was an accident, but I've never believed that. Diane was careful. She would never have ignored a carbon monoxide detector going off." "Did she have a detector?" "That's the thing, she did. It was disconnected. The investigators said she must have removed the battery, but Diane would never do that. Someone else did it. Someone who knew she'd be home that night. Someone who wanted her dead." I hung up feeling sick. For the next week, I avoided the conference room entirely. But Diane wouldn't let me. I started seeing her everywhere, reflected in my computer screen, standing at the end of the hallway, sitting in the reception area, waiting chairs when I arrived in the morning. She was getting stronger, more solid, more desperate, and she was always staring at Mr. Berkshire's office door. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I went to the police. I told them about Diane's ghost, about what Patricia had told me, about my suspicions that Mr. Berkshire had murdered her. They were sympathetic, but clear. Ghost sightings weren't evidence. Without proof, there was nothing they could do. The case had been closed for 9 years, but they agreed to look into his business practices. And that's when everything unraveled. It turned out Diane had been right. Berkshire had been embezzling from clients for years, hiding it through complex accounting tricks. Once investigators started digging, they found a trail of fraud going back decades. Mr. Berkshire was arrested, the firm was shut down, and I was out of a job. But the night after his arrest, I went back to the office one last time to collect my final paycheck. The building was dark and empty. As I walked down the hallway toward my desk, I passed the conference room. The door was open. Inside, I could see Diane sitting at the table. But this time, she wasn't staring at nothing. She was looking at me, and she was smiling. A peaceful, grateful smile. "Thank you," she whispered. And then she was gone. The temperature in the hallway returned to normal. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the office for months lifted. Diane Morrison finally had justice, and she could rest. I never saw her again. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else ever will, or if she's truly at peace now. I'd like to think she is, because some spirits aren't evil. They're just desperate to be heard, desperate for someone to care enough to listen. If you've stayed with me through all 3 of these stories, thank you. Leave a like, subscribe, and share these tales they have touched you. Because the truth is, monsters come in all forms. Some are strangers who stalk you. Some are colleagues who smile while they destroy you. And some are ghosts who refuse to stay silent about the injustices done to them.